beings all over the world, in all places, and so far as we can tell, at all times, have believed something in us survives death. For those of us interested in such a belief, it is only natural that we would want to know what happens to that something in us after we die. If some part of us does indeed survive death, what becomes of it? Does that part come back to this world to live again? Do we reincarnate? Most of us, as busy as we are, have pondered the possibility of reincarnation, or some idea of rebirth. While the concept of reincarnation is most widely expressed in Eastern traditions, like Hinduism and Buddhism, notable individuals from the West have also embraced the concept. The well-known psychologist Carl Jung considered it a spontaneous, innate idea based on certain archetypes of the collective unconscious. Jung writes, "I am of the opinion that the psyche is the most tremendous fact of human life. The fact that people talk about rebirth means that a store of psychic experiences designated by that term must actually exist." The inventor Thomas Edison, when asked by reporters if he believed in survival after death, answered, "The only survival I can conceive is to start a new Earth cycle again." Edison's friend, Henry Ford, reported adopting the theory of reincarnation when he was 26, stating that, "When I discovered reincarnation, it was as if I had found a universal plan. I realized that there was a chance to work out my ideas." If you preserve a record of this conversation, write it so that it puts men's minds at ease. I would like to communicate to others the calmness that the long view of life gives to us.
How shall I say, we don't pay sufficient attention to it in our
While
lives.
some may argue the importance of reincarnation as a reality of the psyche, many may question whether it is a fact of nature. What proof do we have? And are there valid objections to the concept? Of what value ultimately is the idea of reincarnation to the seeker of truth? The teacher, Jiddu Krishnamurti, when giving his talks or commentaries on living, used to invite questions after them, and very frequently those questions would concern the subjects of death and reincarnation. Krishnamurti, however, usually refused to answer such questions.
He often talked about the need to die and be reborn every second of our lives as a continual process, and not to worry about the one death or one rebirth which we might look forward to. However, on one occasion, Krishnamurti did answer a question about reincarnation directly. The question on that occasion was put to him by a very old friend, someone he had known all his life. The friend asked, "Is there or is there not reincarnation? Yes or no?" And on this occasion, Krishnamurti responded differently than usual. He did not attempt to direct the questioner's attention to other matters. Instead, he answered the question. This is the way he began. Reincarnation is a fact, but it is not true. Now, both halves of that answer deserve very careful attention. Reincarnation, said Krishnamurti, is a fact. After we die, we, or something in us that we identify as us, is born again in another body and continues the process of experiencing this world. Well, now that's fine, but what reason do we have, other than the word of teachers like Krishnamurti, for believing that reincarnation is indeed a fact? There are two kinds of reasons. One is specific evidence that reincarnation happens, and the other is the general explanatory power of the concept. And there are also objections to the idea.
One objection to the idea of reincarnation is that if we have past lives, we ought to remember them. But is a lack of memory regarding past lives sufficient reason for rejecting reincarnation as a hypothesis?
Memories are notoriously unreliable. Not only do we regularly forget things that happened, we sometimes remember things that never did. Memory is bad evidence. It deceives us all of our lives. Why should we not expect it to deceive us across lives? Moreover, to remember all of our past lives would in fact be impossible. A perfect and complete memory for events even of this life would be a curse. A total recall of all the trivia of everyday events from a single lifetime would be a monstrous cluttering of the mind. Forgetfulness is a blessing. It is necessary if we are to function effectively day to day. What we forget is as important as what we remember. And if that's true of a single lifetime, how much truer must it be of a series of lives stretching into the distant past?
Another proposed shortcoming to the idea of reincarnation has to do with the recent population explosion. If some part of us is reborn from previous lives, why has there been such a drastic increase of our human population in recent times? Shouldn't there have been the same total number of people on the planet, say in prehistoric times, as there are today?
The assumption that we have a steadily increasing population through the millennia is based on such evidence as known remains, bones and artifacts, and on estimates of the number of people that can be supported by a given area of land in hunting and gathering cultures. It's also an extrapolation from the fact that we have seen, undeniably, an increase in population in recent years. Now, it's certainly likely that our present population is the largest the Earth has ever supported at one time. It is possible, however, that the present-day increase is a temporary fluctuation rather than part of a long-term and continuous expansion. That's what we don't know. Those who cite the population explosion as an argument against reincarnation usually suppose that rebirth takes place almost immediately after death, whereas the Theosophical tradition is that a long time normally elapses between incarnations. The exact length of that time is said to vary greatly, ranging from a few years to a kalpa, that is, a period of millions of years. Now, either of those extremes would be exceptional, and for most persons, the time between incarnations is said to vary from a few hundred to a few thousand years. The exact time depending on the quality of the incarnation and the availability of a suitable rebirth opportunity. From the standpoint of reincarnation, let me suggest, the explanation of the population explosion is really fairly obvious. Think of a large pool of individuals reincarnating during a time in the Earth's history when conditions are relatively stable. They reincarnate infrequently, the pull of new experiences being very weak. Then, for whatever reason, conditions alter radically. A new social world with vastly increased possibilities for human experience comes into existence. The desire for new experiences is accordingly intensified, and the reincarnating individuals come back to birth much more frequently and after significantly shorter periods between lives. The result would be a population explosion, a local fluctuation. Some people say it's unchristian, but in fact, reincarnation formed part of the beliefs of some early Christians. And several modern Christian theologians, notably Geddes McGregor and Quincy Howe Jr., have argued that a belief in reincarnation is fully compatible with Christianity.
So what evidence is there in support of reincarnation that goes beyond public opinion? One kind of evidence comes from persons who have a type of clairvoyance that might be called, as Professor Algeo puts it, tapping into the memory of nature. Here, certain individuals are said to be capable of remembering events from the past that are unrelated to them in any ordinary sense. Events and persons not only of this lifetime, but from past lifetimes as well. It's as if they are tapping into some small part of a larger mental field that records everything that has ever occurred in nature. One such individual reported to have these incredible capabilities was the well-known clairvoyant Edgar Cayce. As a child in Kentucky, Cayce had a variety of paranormal experiences which include seeing and talking with recently deceased relatives. Later, as a young man, Cayce entered a trance state in which he diagnosed his own ailment, an acute case of laryngitis, and successfully prescribed a treatment for it. Cayce's success in curing himself led medical persons to request his remarkable talents in the physical diagnosis and treatment of others. He conducted physical readings of various patients for about 25 years before his clairvoyance took a different tack. In reading the analysis of one of his trance readings, Cayce was surprised to find that he had talked about reincarnation as an indisputable fact. Reincarnation seemed a bizarre idea for Cayce, but throughout the remainder of his life he continued with his trance investigations, which were increasingly directed toward analyzing the causes of present illness in terms of past life experiences. Those sessions that focused on the earlier lives of the patients are known as life readings. Cayce did approximately 2,500 life readings, which are cited by many as strong evidence in support of reincarnation.
However, there is a problem with the information about past lives as reported by sensitives and clairvoyants, even such a talented one as Edgar Cayce. The former personality of the client would have been either obscure or prominent. If the past life identity was obscure, it's very difficult to check out the facts that the clairvoyant has seen. Detailed and specific they may be, but it's hard to find out whether they are veridical, whether or not they're true. Records of ordinary people were very poorly kept in the past. On the other hand, if the reported former incarnation was as a famous person, then the facts of that person's life will be described in books, and so might be known to the clairvoyant through perfectly normal channels. The readings of a sensitive about past lives are almost always subject to this catch-22. It's extremely rare that the information can be checked for accuracy in a source that could not possibly have been available to the sensitive. Therefore, most past life readings are in fact not helpful as evidence about reincarnation to convince the skeptical, however useful they may be for other purposes. So let's consider another kind of evidence, that comes from memories induced by hypnosis, a very recently popular kind of activity. Investigations of past lives by hypnosis, or mesmerism as it used to be called, have been made for longer than you might think. Most people think of that as being a very recent activity, and indeed it has been recently fashionable. But the technique has been used since the second half of the 19th century, for well over 100 years. Although the technique came to be widely used only since the late 1950s. The most famous case about that time was one that I am sure all of you have heard of. It was of a Colorado housewife who was regressed by a hypnotist, Maury Bernstein, expressly in an effort to establish evidence for reincarnation. Under the hypnosis, the Colorado housewife remembered her life, a former life, in the early 19th century as a lower middle-class Irish woman. The case was described in a book called The Search for Bridey Murphy.
With a home tape recorder and in the presence of witnesses, Maury Bernstein hypnotically regressed the housewife.
Have you ever been to a wake?
Oh, yes, I've been to the wake before the funeral. Oh, with Brian.
While under hypnosis, she had remembered quite specific details concerning her proposed past life as Bridey Murphy. For example, she remembered living in Cork and Belfast, Ireland, and that she had married a barrister named Brian McCarthy. She had traded with a grocer named John Kerrigan and with another named Farr. Her husband, who was a Catholic, whereas Bridey was a Protestant, attended St. Teresa's Church and wrote for a Belfast newspaper, the Newsletter. Since historical records from early and mid-19th century Ireland are incomplete, very specific details of this sort, about an otherwise unknown person, are hard to verify. And yet, the information given to Bernstein by the housewife has not been shown to clash with known facts concerning the people and places she describes. For example, no records of births, deaths, or marriages currently exist from the time Bridey Murphy purports having lived in Cork and Belfast. So while possible, her birth date, claims of religion and marriage to Brian McCarthy, as well as her death, are all unconfirmed. However, she refers to her father as a cropper, a farmer, and names correctly what crops were raised in Cork at the time. Bridey's statements about living in the meadows as a child are also possible, since an 1801 map of Cork shows an area named Mardyke Meadows, where some half-dozen houses are indicated. Furthermore, the name of Sean Brian McCarthy, Bridey's purported husband, is found in the Belfast business directories of 1858 and 1861. Concerning the two grocers with whom Bridey remembered having traded, staff members of the Belfast Library, after extensive research, found two grocers, Farr and Kerrigan, listed in an old city directory of Belfast. Moreover, they were the only grocers listed as being in the foodstuffs business. These and other details, too numerous to mention, are so obscure that it is hard to imagine how anyone could have come to know, in any normal fashion, this Ireland of over a century ago.
Now, the case of Bridey Murphy and the book about her became famous, if not infamous. Some people who objected to the notion of reincarnation because of its implications for their own philosophy of life, got into league with several magazines and newspapers who were glad to debunk the case for the boost the publicity would give the circulation of those periodicals. Charges were made that the hypnotized subject, the Colorado housewife, had an Irish aunt from whom she had heard stories about Ireland as a child, and that she also had a neighbor who was named Bridey Murphy. However, the aunt turned out to know very little about Ireland. In fact, like most Irish Americans, right? Most Irish Americans know almost nothing about Ireland. Neither did the aunt in this case. Moreover, the aunt had no contact with the Colorado housewife as a child. There was a neighbor called Bridey, but in fact, Bridey is a relatively common Irish name, being short for Bridget. And the neighbor's last name was not Murphy. But as it happened, she was the mother of the editor of one of the newspapers who was trying to debunk the case. Well, the Bridey Murphy case focused popular attention on reincarnation and hypnotic regression. Because of the conspiracy to discredit the case, many people today assume that it was fraud, deliberate or unconscious. However, the only clear dishonesty in the case, I think, was on the part of those who were trying to discredit it. We will probably never know the truth about Bridey Murphy, except that the case began a fad of investigating past lives through hypnotic regression.
In addition to Maury Bernstein, there are other individuals who have experimented with hypnotic regressions of one kind or another. The results of much of this research is inconclusive as evidence supportive of reincarnation. In fact, certain hypnotic regressions suggest something entirely different from past life memories. Professor Algeo.
There was an in-depth study of a single subject made by Jonathan Venn. He conducted 60 hypnotic interviews with the same subject back into the same purported life. And he made extensive efforts to confirm or disconfirm all of the facts reported by this subject. And he weighed reincarnation against other possible explanations of the purported memories. Venn's very carefully studied case, I regret to tell you, provides no evidence for reincarnation. but only for what is called cryptomnesia, that is to say, hidden memory. All of us in our lives have occasions when we will read something in a book or hear something on television, and then some time will elapse and we will forget where we read it or where we heard it, but that fact, that idea will pop up in our minds and we will think it's our own. We'll think that we originated it. We have that kind of hidden memory. Okay. The Cayce Venn study provides also some evidence for subconscious dramatization. However, it is only a single case and certainly doesn't preclude the possibility of other regressions being genuine examples of past life memories.
More arresting examples of apparent past life memories can be found in the Bloxham tapes. They are taped records of some 400 regressions conducted by Arnell Bloxham, former president of the British Society of Hypnotherapists. One remarkable case involves a Welsh housewife who was given the pseudonym of Jane Evans.
Bloxham regressed her to 6 earlier lives, and the second of those is the one I will mention to you. The second life of Jane Evans was as Rebecca, a Jewess living in England in the late 12th century who was killed during the York Massacre of 1190.
As Rebecca, Jane Evans recounted that during a mob uprising against the Jews, her family was refused admission to the castle of York, where in fact most of the Jews of the town sought refuge, only to be betrayed and murdered a short while later.
Instead, she and her family took refuge in the crypt of a small church outside, she said, the big copper gate of York. Now, the detail of the place of refuge is important, because if this hypnotic account had been based on remembered historical accounts of the persecution, if it had been an example of cryptomnesia, one would expect Jane Evans to have had her Rebecca personality take refuge in the castle, where in fact most of the Jews did, and which figures very prominently in historical accounts of the York Massacre.
Of greater interest is the fact that she explicitly remembered taking refuge in the crypt of the church. Crypts are burial chambers, usually found under the high altar of a church, and yet none of the over 40 churches of York was known to have one. Only the cathedral had one, and Rebecca specifically denied having taken refuge in it. The church Rebecca described is almost surely St. Mary's, Castlegate, but since it too was absent of a crypt, her account appeared to be wrong.
However, during a later remodeling of the church, later after the Bloxham tapes had been made, and indeed even after they had been aired on BBC, during a later remodeling of the church, guess what they discovered in the church of St. Mary's, Castlegate? A crypt where none had been known to exist before. Now that's a highly improbable detail about which the hypnotized subject could not possibly have known. Moreover, the dramatic conviction with which Jane Evans told the story of her Rebecca personality impressed everyone who heard it. In describing her fruitless efforts to escape the mob and protect her daughter by hiding in the crypt, she became hysterical with terror. On leaving the session, Jane Evans fainted and was frightened and ill for days afterwards. If some of the Bloxham tapes are not what they purport to be, the relived memories of episodes from past lives, then they are just as great mysteries of another sort.
In addition to special techniques, such as hypnotic regression, that purport to help one relive past lives, other researchers are studying another interesting phenomenon known as spontaneous memory.
Those memories are usually sudden flashes, like a scene from a past life, that are associated with altered states of consciousness. The most interesting and significant cases of spontaneous memory are those among young children. One scholar, Ian Stevenson, professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, has devoted most of his professional career to studying such cases of spontaneous memory that seem to indicate reincarnation. A typically noteworthy case is that of Jagdish Chandra, who was born in 1923 in northern India. Shortly after his 3rd birthday, the child Jagdish began demanding that his father get his car for him. However, the family had no car. Cars at that time were uncommon among private persons in northern India. When the father realized that in that and other such remarks his son was referring to things from a past life, he began to keep a diary of the boy's statements. And because of that diary, this case is one of the best documented of its kind. Jagdish identified his former home as being in Benares. He described the house in which he had lived in considerable detail. He specified that it was located near a ghat, a staircase leading down to the Ganges River, and gave the name of the ghat. He reported that his family name was Pandey. And with such specific bits of information, Jagdish's father began to make efforts to confirm the facts his son had reported. He discovered that there was indeed a family of Pandeys in Benares who lived in the location the boy had remembered, and that they had a young son, Jai Gopal, who had died a few years earlier. Eventually, his father took Jagdish to Benares, where the boy was able to lead his father to the Pandey house through the confusion of Benares streets and to identify various of Jai Gopal's relatives when he met them. When he was taken to the bathing ghat, Jagdish knew the procedures to be followed, even though his home was not near a river and he had no experience with the customs involved in bathing in the Ganges. Many other facts and behavior patterns seem to identify Jagdish Chandra with Jai Gopal. However, the refusal of the Pandey father to cooperate in the investigation was an impediment to its successful completion. But even that refusal turned out to be evidence. Jagdish remembered that the father from his former life had once murdered a man and hidden his body in a well. If that memory was accurate, Father Pandey could hardly be expected to insist enthusiastically in a line of inquiry that might prove dangerous for him. Well, Ian Stevenson's investigations, I've just mentioned this one case. He has case after case of this sort, which he's investigated. These investigations, I think, are very strong evidence for reincarnation because they were carefully conducted and documented extensively. Stevenson himself does not claim that his investigations prove reincarnation. That would be a very unscholarly thing to do, and he's a good, sound scholar and scientist. What he says is that they are suggestive of reincarnation, and that if you take cases like this, you take facts like this, you've got to offer some explanation for them. What are the possible explanations? And he looks at every possible explanation and finally concludes that for a large number of these cases, the simplest explanation, finally, is that the cases are exactly what they purport to be: remembered memories by young children of former incarnations.
There has been time to look at only a few of the many cases cited as evidence for reincarnation. While some of these cases may point to such psychological phenomena as cryptamnesia and subconscious dramatization, indeed many, if not most of them, seemingly point to reincarnation as the simplest, most plausible explanation to date. Perhaps of greater interest is the question, what value is there in investigating or even in accepting reincarnation? Professor Algeo.
Reasons for believing in reincarnation are not limited to such evidence that it has occurred. Another kind of reason comes from the power of reincarnation to explain things in the world that puzzle us. One of the remarkable things about human beings is the propensity we have to be different from one another. Two children of the same parents, raised in the same household, may turn out to be quite unlike one another. The environment and the heredity of both children may be the same or very similar, but they may turn out to be very different. If reincarnation is a fact, then in addition to those two factors, as explanations of our behavior, there is a third. To be sure, we are what we are because of the genes we inherit from our ancestors. No doubt about that. We are also what we are because of the pressures of the world around us and how we respond to those pressures. No argument. But the other factor is the inclinations and predispositions that we have developed life after life. We are who and what we are now because of what we have done in past lives. The Buddhist technical term for those inclinations and predispositions that we bring with us from former existences is the skandhas. The skandhas are the fruits of our actions in all our earlier incarnations. Reincarnation explains why we are the way we are, not because of, but in spite of our family and upbringing. Another reason for believing in reincarnation is our conviction that there must be justice in life. One of the perennial concerns of human beings has been that of the existence of justice in the world. How is it that the wicked seem to prosper and the virtuous to suffer? Why is an innocent baby born with a malformed body? What brings misfortune and pain to a good person? In Judeo-Christian terms, if God is both good and all-powerful, why does he permit evil and apparently unmerited suffering to exist? Well, reincarnation maintains that the appearance of injustice in the world is a consequence of our limited knowledge and vision. If, instead of one lifetime only, we could see the whole series of an individual's incarnations with the working out of karma across a chain of lifetimes, we would see that perfect and strict justice governs all events. Disorder no more holds sway in the moral realm than in the physical world. Just as the physical world is ruled by cause and effect, so the inviolable law of karma governs the results that follow upon all the choices we make. Death is only a brief interruption in the working out of that law and its consequences. It stretches over life after life to encompass the whole of an individual's existence in this and all other worlds. But perhaps the greatest appeal of reincarnation for many persons is the effectiveness with which it explains the purpose and goal of life. One lifetime is clearly not enough to learn everything Earth has to teach us. One lifetime is not enough to experience the full range of joy and bittersweet sorrow that life has to offer. Repeated lives on Earth give us a chance to catch up in our next lifetime on what we have missed during this one. They are the promise that we will eventually have an opportunity to experience all of life's possibilities and thereby to develop our full potential. Well, so far we have been considering the fact of reincarnation and what reasons there are for believing that it may be a fact. But what about the other half of Krishnamurti's statement? What did he mean when he said that reincarnation is a fact, but it is not true? In theosophical teaching, and in Krishnamurti's teaching as well, there is a sharp contrast between two levels of existence. On the one hand, there is this world we live in and experience and think of as real, but in which all truths are relative, and which is itself a kind of great collective illusion that our minds and senses perceive in only one out of many possible ways. The world we think of as real is actually a world of unreality. The world that is really real is one we cannot know with our minds. It is one we cannot reason about, but one that we can experience directly if we devote ourselves to doing so. That world of the really real is one of wisdom and love and power, complete, total, unconditioned, absolute. It is referred to in the motto of the Theosophical Society, "There is no religion higher than truth." Once we have experienced the world of truth, no substitute will satisfy us. It is full, perfect, abiding. Reincarnation is a fact in this world of our everyday experience, this relative world of unreality. But there is no reincarnation in the realm of truth. Through the unreal, we reach the real. Through darkness, light. Through death, immortality. And through reincarnation, we reach true being. When we no longer have a need to be born, we will no longer have a need to die. Then there will be no reincarnation. And that is true.